Today, Jacob Goldman's going to speak. He's from Energy Tax Savers. You may have read what I've written about him. He is by far the best speaker I've ever seen at any energy event. He is hilarious. Unfortunately, you can't watch him in, or some of you maybe have seen him in public, but he's a combination of, Jacob, I hope you take this right, but he's a combination of, let's say, Oprah. He's got that magnetism, but he's also got a little bit of Chris Farley and the guy that lives in the trailer down by the river. He's got a little bit of that in there too, which is just hilarious. He's a funny speaker. And anyway, I'm going to have Jacob introduce himself because he knows him more than I. I've just watched him speak a couple times, and I think he is the best. But he's going to speak, as you probably know, about the IRA and how you can get more money for your energy savings, your energy efficiency and renewable energy projects. And it will make your projects more, let's say, your clients are more likely to go for them with all this money that's coming from the federal government. Jacob, why don't you introduce yourself and get to it?
Great, thank you. I can only fail now that you've hyped me up so much. I apologize. So we're going to talk about 179D. We're going to talk about tax credits. I'm Jacob Goldman. I'm Vice President of Energy Tax Savers. With that, we're going to go to the next slide. What you're going to want to do, everybody take out your phones, put on your camera, shine it on the QR code, and that's going to, when you hit the QR code, that's going to auto-generate an email. You're going to want to hit send. That's going to get you a copy of this presentation. You're going to want a copy of the presentation. There's a lot of links in here. Some of the links are very long. And you're going to get a copy of that if you take a snapshot of that QR code. So I highly recommend taking a snapshot of the QR code. If it's not working for you, just shoot me an email and say, please send slides, send the slides, and we'll send you a copy. But today we're going to talk about Section 48, the investment tax credit. You know, sometimes it's called the alternative energy credits. We'll talk about those. That changes over in 2025 to Section 48E. We're then going to talk about 5-year makers. We're really excited about depreciation. You should be excited about depreciation as well. And the reason you should be excited is because of the time value of money. The time value of money is the reason depreciation, accelerated depreciation, is very valuable to you and to your clients. And to people doing these types of projects. We're going to talk about 179D, which is a tax deduction. So Section 48 is a tax credit. Section 179D is a tax deduction. Credit, a $1 credit is worth $1. A $1 deduction is worth whatever your tax rate is. So let's say you're in the 30% bracket. A $1 deduction would be worth 30 cents. And lastly, we're going to talk about prevailing wage and apprenticeship. One question, will somebody be monitoring the questions? If you have a question, don't hesitate to ask it right then and there. And hopefully somebody's going to be able to monitor them and just tell me the question. I'd be glad to answer it right then and there when it's asked. Does that work for the team?
Yeah, I'll take care of the questions. John, if you see it pop up, you want to do that as well, but I have the pane up on my screen right now.
Great. And with that, let's get into it. Let's go to the next slide. So there are 25 different tax incentives in the Inflation Reduction Act, and that doesn't count all the other types, you know, grants and all the other things in the Inflation Reduction Act. There's 25 different tax incentives. I'm only going to be talking about the items in green. I'm not talking about all the other ones. Some of them I can talk about. So if you have questions about EV charging stations, that's this 30C, the alternative fuel refueling property credit. I'm glad to talk to you offline on EV charging, but I don't know anything about zero emission nuclear power production. I don't know anything about second generation biofuel incentives. But some of these other ones in white, I could speak to you on and be glad to talk to you. So if you have a question on one of these other credits, don't hesitate to reach out and I'll tell you if I have any information on it. But today's presentation is just on the items in green. And with that, we can go on to the next slide. So Section 48 has a bunch of technologies that it incentivizes. Once again, it's called the investment tax credit or the alternative energy tax credit. There's been an investment tax credit in the code for a long time. Solar, for example, used to have a 30% credit, and now it's a misnomer out there that the Inflation Reduction Act increased these credits. In actuality, there are some cases where it's actually a decrease. So solar, for example, goes from a 30% credit down to a 6% credit as a base credit. Ground source used to have a 10% credit. The base credit is now 6%. Combined heat and power, CHP, that had a 10% credit. The base credit now is 6%. Thermal storage, thermal energy storage, where you're making ice at night and cooling your building during the day, that never had a tax credit. So it went from a 0% credit to a 6% credit. But there are ways to qualify for certain bonuses where you can take your 6% credit, turn it into a 30% credit, turn it into a 40%, turn it into a 50%, turn it all the way into a 70% credit in the case of solar and wind. All the other technologies top out at 50%, but solar and wind can go all the way up to 70%. And we're going to talk about how that does that when we go through the presentation here, and we're ready for the next slide. So probably the most interesting part of the Inflation Reduction Act is the development of this Section 6417. You know, I kind of feel like Oprah Winfrey. You mentioned Oprah Winfrey before. I kind of feel like Oprah Winfrey. Like, if you have projects that are for state and local governments, they get a tax credit. You have projects for not-for-profits, they get a tax credit. It's unbelievable that a tax credit now can go to entities that don't pay taxes. Now, they don't actually get a tax credit, they get what's called an elective pay. But when their project is completed, you know, if you went back a slide, you'd see all those solar, wind, combined heat and power, geothermal, ground source, all those technologies. If a state or local government or a not-for-profit does any of those technologies, if you do any of those technologies, they get the same tax incentive after their project is placed in service. So it's unbelievable that Section 6417 created this opportunity for those types of entities to get all those incentives. Now, there's one group that does not get a tax incentive. That's the federal. If you're doing a federal project, unfortunately, they don't want to kind of move deck chairs on the Titanic. They don't want one federal agency making payments to another federal agency. But on top of state and local governments and not-for-profits, Tennessee Valley Authority, Indian Tribal, Alaska Native, energy co-ops, all of them can now get this elective pay. They can get a direct payment after their project is completed in the same amounts of that 6%, 30%, 40%, 50%, all the way up to 70%. They can get a direct pay for those projects. Now, because all those entities got this new way to get a tax incentive, they have to pre-register. Now, you might think, what pre-register? I got to do it before the project starts. Pre-registration means pre-register after your project is completed. IRS obviously has a different belief system on what pre-registration means. But you pre-register for the credit. So once your project is completed, you pre-register for the credit. You get a registration number. You then put that registration number on a tax filing, and then 8 weeks after that, theoretically, you'll get an elective pay for your not-for-profits and state and local governments. Now, because there's this other way to get incentives for these entities, this unique way, they did put some haircuts in place. So if you're a state and local government doing using tax-exempt bonds, there's a 15% haircut. So if you qualified for a 40% credit, it drops down to a 34% credit. That's the 15% haircut if you're using tax-exempt bonds. There's another 10% haircut, and there's 3 different ways. You got 3 ways you can avoid the 10% haircut. One is by being a small project. Do a project under a megawatt. If you're bigger than a megawatt, then at least do it with domestic content. If you meet the domestic content rules, there's no haircut. And lastly, if you start your project here in 2023, then there's no haircut. So if any one of those 3 will avoid the haircut. But if you start your project next year, you don't meet domestic content, and you're bigger than a megawatt, unfortunately, there's going to be a 10% haircut. Your 30% credit is going to drop down to a 27% credit. So unfortunately, there is a haircut for those projects that didn't start this year, also don't meet domestic content, and are bigger than a megawatt. Then you have to have a haircut. Next slide. If you are a tax-paying entity, if you're a commercial entity, this is not for not-for-profits, this is not for state and local governments, this is just for tax-paying entities, you have the ability to transfer your credits, meaning you can sell your credits. So why would you want to sell your credit? Well, let's say you're a taxpayer, but you don't owe taxes this year. You might want to sell your credit. Let's say you're a REIT, real estate investment trust. They don't pay taxes. They can now do these projects and sell their credit. Now, if you qualify for a $100,000 credit, you're not going to get $100,000 when you sell it. It looks like, and I've given you 7 different organizations that are facilitating the transfer of tax credits. If you use one of those entities, we're hearing that they're selling for around 90 cents on the dollar. Does that mean it might be as low as 80 cents on the dollar, or it could be as high as 95 cents on the dollar? Potentially. But we're hearing anecdotally that if you had that $100,000 credit, you might be able to sell it for $90,000. Now, if you do the 6418, if you're a tax-paying entity and you want to sell your credits, you do have to pre-register. Just like the pre-register for state and local, you have to pre-register after your project's done to get your registration number, and then that registration number is utilized for the credit transfer. These organizations will need that registration number in order for you to be able to transfer those credits. So not-for-profit, state and local government, 6417. For-profit entities that currently are not profitable or don't typically pay taxes, like a REIT, they can now sell their credit. So there's a much larger universe of people that can benefit from doing these type of projects: solar, ground source, thermal storage, CHP, wind, electrochromic glass, all those. If you're doing those technologies, there's a much bigger universe of parties that can take advantage of it now. Next slide. So I kind of feel like I'm on an infomercial now. You started a 6% credit. There's 3 easy ways to get the 5-time bonus. You need to act now. Do any of these 3 items so you can get that 5-time bonus. The first way you can get the 5-time bonus is by starting your project before January 29, 2023. So if you started your project before January 29, 2023, you automatically qualify for the 5-time bonus. Your 6% turns into 30%. Another way you can qualify, the second way you can qualify, is if your project is less than a megawatt. Now, ground source is not typically measured in megawatts. So we put 1 megawatt, convert to tons, and we got 284 tons. So if your ground source project is less than 284 tons, you get the 5-time bonus, 30% credit. Now, the ground source industry actually is advocating for 444 tons. Right this second, IRS has not accepted that guidance. They haven't rejected it either, but they haven't accepted it. So when they accept that, and hopefully they do, then ground source will be able to qualify at 444 tons. So we really hope that they win that. If your project is bigger than a megawatt and you didn't start it before January 29th, the only way you can qualify is by meeting the prevailing wage and the apprenticeship requirement. Those are 2 separate requirements. You have to meet the prevailing wage requirement, and you have to separately meet the apprenticeship requirement. And on top of that, you have to commit to using prevailing wage for any alterations or repairs for 5 years. For 5 years after you place it in service, you have to use prevailing wage and apprenticeship. And we'll talk about how you qualify for the prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirement to get this 5-time bonus. So once again, start your project before January 29th, automatically 5-time bonus, 30%. Projects less than a megawatt or less than 284 tons, automatically 5-time bonus. If you don't meet either of those, though, then you have to meet prevailing wage and apprenticeship. But wait, there's more. There's another bonus. There's a domestic content bonus. Now, the domestic content bonus is a 2% bonus, so it takes your 6%, changes it to 8%. But if you meet the 5-time bonus requirement, then that 2% turns into 10%. You go from 30% up to 40%. So how do you meet the domestic content bonus? 100% of the cost of structural steel and iron have to be domestically sourced. It has to be domestically sourced. 100% of structural steel and iron on the eligible project. We're only talking about the eligible project, meaning your ground source project, your solar project, your CHP. So to the extent that any of those projects have structural steel or iron, 100% of it has to be domestically sourced. And in addition, 40% of manufactured product has to be domestically sourced, domestically made. So 40% of manufactured products, 100% of structural steel and iron. And then if you can show that, you qualify for the domestic content bonus. You take your 30% to 40, or you take your 6% to 8%. But that's not it. Wait, there's more. There's another bonus coming up. Next slide. There's the energy community bonus. The energy community bonus, once again, is a 2% bonus, turning into a 10% bonus if you meet the 5-time criteria. There are 5 ways to qualify. Wait, there's only 4 ways. IRS had a 5th way given to them by the law, but they couldn't figure out how to map it. And therefore, the 5th way is not eligible until they find a way to map it. And so right this second, there's only 4 ways. 3 of those are map-based. So if you're in a census tract or adjoining census tract to a coal mine that was closed since 2000, so if your project is in a location next to a coal mine or in the census tracts adjacent to that, then you get the 2% or 10%. If you're in a census tract or adjoining census tract where a coal-fired plant was closed since 2010, you get the bonus. If you're in an area with 0.17 direct employment related to coal, oil, or natural gas and higher than average unemployment, you also get the bonus. And then lastly, if you're doing a project on a brownfield site, that project also qualifies for the bonus. Now, you probably want the map. So if you just jot down that email, that web address down at the bottom, that's an A2CE47D47. What I'm trying to tell you is at the end of the presentation, there's another chance for you to get these slides. You're going to want these slides so you get all these links. The links allow you to see, and if you go to the next slide, you can see what the map looks like. This is the map of the whole country for the energy communities. There's the web address. You don't want to have to write that down. You're going to want a copy of these slides. So either send me an email or take a picture of that QR code at the end of the presentation to get a copy of these slides so you can go directly to this map. That in the upper right-hand corner, when you go to the website, you can actually type in an address. We've had projects where across the street was an energy community, but our project, unfortunately, was not in an energy community. So, you know, it could go down to the street level on whether a project qualifies or not for this energy community bonus. So what I'll tell you is the orange ones are the closed coal mines or the closed coal plants, and the tan around them are the adjacent census tracts. Those ones are going to be around forever for this incentive. So if you have a project in those areas, you're safe to get the energy community. If you're doing a project in the bluish purple areas, they're based off of 0.17% of employment coming from coal, oil, and natural gas and higher than average unemployment. Well, unemployment changes monthly. Luckily, the IRS said in May, we're going to reanalyze. So every May, they're going to look to see if that location is higher than average unemployment. So these purplish blue areas might disappear if they all of a sudden are lower than average unemployment. In which case, what that means is you want to start, if you're in one of these blue areas, you're going to want to start your project before May because then you're grandfathered into the energy community bonus. If you start your project after May and they change it and the blue disappears, there's no bonus for you. There's no bonus energy community credit. So it is very important that you start your projects before they change the blue areas because unemployment changed in that area. So that's just some guidance for you. Every May, they're going to update the blue areas and it might change. And so you want to start your project. If you're in a blue area, you're going to want to start your project before they change that. Next slide. So this credit is this bonus is the last bonus, and it's a little different than the other ones. And this is the most time sensitive. So this bonus is time sensitive. It's different in that you have to apply for it, and then it has to be allocated to you, allotted to you. And it's only for solar and wind. It's not for any of the other technologies. It's only for solar and wind. And so what needs to occur for you to be able to apply is you have to be under contract, but not yet placed in service. Under contract, but not yet placed in service for your solar or wind project. So if to the extent any of you have a project that is currently under contract for solar, but not yet placed in service, you could be constructing, the project could be ongoing, but as long as it's not placed in service, then you can apply for this low income bonus. And here's the kicker. The application window closes on Friday. The application window closes on Friday. So if you have a project, there's still time to get your application in, as long as you're under contract and not yet placed in service, and that you're in a low-income community. So there's different categories you can apply for. You can apply because you're in a low-income community, that's category 1, or that you're on tribal lands, that's category 2, or that you're in the project is for covered housing, that's category 3, or the project is for low-income economic benefit, that's category 4. There's different allotment amounts and there's different credit amounts. Category 1 and 2 only have a 10% credit. Category 3 and 4 have 20% credits. You do need to apply, and the application window basically closes on Friday. Next slide. So category 1 is map-based. The other 3 categories are not map-based, so I'll talk about them first. Tribal lands, obviously, if you're on tribal lands, your project can qualify for the category 2. Category 3, there's a web address, that energy.gov web address lists 2 pages of covered housing. If your project is in covered housing and the solar power is going to be allocated equitably among the occupants, then that project can qualify for category 3. And then category 3 and 4 probably have a little bit of overlap, because if you're in category 3, more than likely you could also be in category 4. It's where you're providing electricity to households with income less than 200% of the poverty line, or households with income less than 80% of the area median income. But the easiest one to qualify for, meaning from knowing if you're in or out, is the category 1. If you go to the next slide, you'll see a map. Unfortunately, we have a lot of low-income communities in our country. The map is only good for the green areas. Only green is a low-income community that qualifies. So once again, you're going to want to jot down that web address. And the best way to do that is by hitting the QR code and getting the email of our presentation, so you have that web address. If you do a project in one of these areas, you are in category 1 and you can apply for that incentive. So we highly recommend to, if you have a solar project that's under contract but not yet completed, then I highly recommend that you see if your project is in one of these low-income communities and then quickly apply. We can assist with that, or you can do it on your own, but we're glad to assist you in applying by Friday. So there is that deadline. So this is the only part of the thing that has a deadline. Now, there is going to be another, it re-ups every year, and they said in the second quarter they're going to re-up it every year. But what I'll tell you is this year is the year that it's going to be the least oversubscribed. We're already applying for 10% of the allotment. So we have to believe it's way oversubscribed at this point. And it's going to be even worse come second quarter of next year, when everybody knows about this incentive. So if you have a project that's under contract but not yet completed in one of these green areas, you should be applying for this by Friday. And there's still time to do it. There's still time to get the applications in. Next slide. So here's all the credits again. The reason that ground source CHP and thermal storage are in bold is because you can qualify for both the credit and the tax deduction, the 179D tax deduction that we're going to talk about in a few minutes. So you can qualify for both. They're both eligible for that for you. So we definitely recommend those technologies go for both the 48 credit and the 179D tax deduction. Next slide. Many of the technologies in Section 48 do not transition over to Section 48E, which comes about for projects started in 2025. So the items in red, besides ground source stays in Section 48. And so it's good in Section 48 all the way to 2035, but it's the only technology that stays in 48. Everything else either expires or becomes 48E. And so we think microturbines and CHP are going to disappear as credits because they don't meet the requirements if you're using typical natural gas. If you're using some sort of clean gas that doesn't increase greenhouse gases, then it's possible that they'll continue on. But if you're using conventional natural gas, then you're not going to be in 48E. Your CHP project, you're going to want to start that in 2024 before 48E takes over. So solar, wind, batteries and thermal storage definitely transition over. So all those technologies have the same exact credit. They qualify the same way, as 48. The items in yellow, they don't produce electricity, so we think potentially they might be dead as well in 48E, unless some guidance comes out from IRS. But it is quite possible that they might be dead when it transitions to 48E starting in 2025. So this is something to have on your radar. We're going to get a lot more guidance on 48E probably late in 2024. But right this second, this is our belief that a number of technologies are going to disappear. Some technologies we definitely know, and then other technologies might disappear because they don't really produce clean electricity. They just happen to be equipment. They don't produce any electricity. They just use or transport electricity. So we're not exactly sure how IRS is going to handle those ones. Next slide. The low income bonus was probably the most important thing, from a time standpoint, but this slide might be the second most. And it's what qualifies on a ground source project. So the bore field and the heat pumps, they definitely qualify for the tax credit, no question. But through a tax interpretation, that's section 1.489C10 IV, if the energy flowing through downstream equipment like pipes, ductworks, heat exchangers, diffusers, VAV boxes, if the energy flowing through it, the heating and cooling energy flowing through it is more than 75% coming from the ground, then that equipment also magically turns into ground source property and qualifies for the tax credit. This is a tremendous opportunity. I was presenting at a ground source conference. The presenter before me's presentation was called worst to first. Ground source might have had the worst first cost, and now maybe it has the best first cost. And if you get a 30, 40, 50% credit on your entire HVAC system, all the way to diffusers, that's a tremendous opportunity to bring down the cost of these projects. So we think that worst to first might actually be true as long as you're in the 30, 40, or 50% realm, and your load is being 75% coming from, at least 75% coming from the ground. So very beneficial to the ground source industry. Unfortunately, this tax interpretation doesn't work in all the different categories because of the tax laws themselves exclude downstream equipment from qualifying. For example, for CHP, downstream equipment doesn't qualify. And likely the same is true for thermal storage as well. So ground source is specifically advantaged here because that downstream equipment, if more than 75% of its heating and cooling load on an annual basis comes from the ground, that equipment magically turns into eligible, tax credit eligible property and gets that same 30, 40, 50% tax credit. Very powerful for the ground source industry. Next slide. Thermal storage, you got to be, this is where you're making ice during the night and cooling your building with the ice during the day, typically. You got to be connected to the heating and ventilation equipment, which means that the thermal storage system and the HVAC system have to be somewhat separate. And this is the indication that that downstream equipment doesn't qualify. You have to be removing heat from or adding heat to a storage medium. There's usually a tank involved, and it has to provide energy for heating or cooling the interior of a residential or commercial building. So it has to be building related. It can't be process related. And this is one of the technologies that switches from 48 and seamlessly goes into 48E with no interruption of tax credit. Next slide. CHP. So CHP is one of the technologies that if you're using natural gas, we think is going to expire. So you're going to want to start your project in 2024. You're going to want to start that project in 2024 in order to get your tax credit. If you're doing really big CHP above 50 megawatts, there's no investment tax credit available. You got to use a different incentive. If you're somewhere between 15 megawatts and 50 megawatts, there's a haircut. So let's say you were at 30 megawatts, the haircut is 15 divided by 30. You'd have to cut your credit in half. So there are those requirements on size. So if you're under 15 megawatts, then you can get your full credit. But there are some rules here. You have to be 60% energy efficient. 20%, at least 20% of the energy has to be used in the form of thermal energy, and at least 20% has to be used in the form of electrical or mechanical power. And then another exclusion down here at the bottom does not include property used to transport the energy source to the facility or distribute the energy produced by the facility. So the equipment that brings the gas in and the equipment that takes the electricity and steam out those pieces of equipment, the labor to install it, that unfortunately does not qualify. So it is limited in that way for CHP. But the main thing, if you're doing traditional CHP with natural gas, you're going to want to, have those projects started in 2024. If you start your project in 2025, we think that project is going to be dead. There's not going to be a tax credit. Next slide. So this is my favorite topic. I love talking about depreciation. Nobody considers depreciation, but this is a real value. The real value of time value of money. Everybody should be getting really excited about depreciation. And what I'll tell you is, if you're putting a conventional piece of HVAC equipment on your roof, for example, that conventional piece of equipment gets depreciated 1/39th a year for 39 years. It's a very slow way to recoup the cost of your project. But you take that conventional equipment out and you put in ground source, for example, and then all the downstream, it magically turns into 5-year property. All those properties I showed you before, the solar, CHP, wind, combined heat power, thermal storage, all those technologies magically turn into energy property, and energy property has 5-year depreciation. So instead of 1/39th a year for 39 years, you get to depreciate it quickly in 5 years. That's the time value money. The time value money is where the real value is. Now, on top of that, there's something called bonus depreciation. In 2023, bonus depreciation is 80%, which means that if you qualify for bonus, 80% of the project cost can be depreciated in year 1. You get to expense 80% of the project cost in year 1. Tremendously valuable for these projects, the ability to expense 80% in year 1. Now, that drops to 60% in 2024 and 40% in the year after that. But we think Congress is going to come in and change us back to 100%. Back in 2022, it was 100%. So 2023 is the first year that it's dropped. So we think this is going to really move people to do these types of projects. Not only do you get the credit, but on your commercial projects, those commercial clients get to accelerate the depreciation. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see what the value of accelerated depreciation is. So let's say we have a $39,000 project. You get to depreciate $1,000 a year for 39 years at a 35% tax bracket. That's worth $350 each year in your pocket for 39 years. If you were to discount that flow of $350 into the current year using an 8% discount rate, that would only be worth $4,158. But you move that to 5 years, it's worth 3 times as much. And even more than that, if you move it to an immediate, if you get to expense some of it, it's even more. So that's where the real value of this depreciation is you do conventional, it's 1/39th a year for 39 years. You turn it into one of those alternative energy items, you're down to 5 years, and you also qualify for bonus, which means immediate for up to 80% right now. Tremendously valuable, and this dovetails perfectly with 179D. Because with 179D, you also get an immediate deduction out to a amount per square foot of the building. So depending on how big the square footage of the building is, will define what you'll qualify on the 179D side. So 179D is another concept related to time value of money. It's moving that 1/39th a year for 39 years to an immediate tax deduction. That's where the real value comes in. Next slide. So 179D is a tax deduction. How do you qualify? You have to do a lighting project, an HVAC project, or a building envelope project. Any of those projects can qualify. Commercial building owners, if you forgot to take your 179D, you can go all the way back to 1/1/2006. For designers, there's a special incentive here for designers of government buildings. And then starting in 2023, that extends to some other building classes. And we're talking about the architects, engineers, ESCOs, design and build contractors. They can take this tax deduction, but they can only go back 3 years. So designers can get this benefit for government buildings and a couple other categories, and we'll see that on the next couple slides.
We do have a question that just came in. I think it was from the previous slide. We'll call him CO. No names. How can we turn more of our traditional energy efficiency measures into these energy equipment?
Yeah, so it's all about design. The tool is you're now getting money from the federal government. So the way you turn it in is you got to show what is the first cost, but what is the energy savings and what are the tax savings? You have to show a cash flow analysis. And with a cash flow analysis, you should be able to show that it makes sense to go from conventional equipment to ground source or thermal storage, for example. When you can get these higher levels of credits and deductions, you should be able to show an economic analysis, a cash flow analysis that shows that you'll benefit by switching over to one of these alternative energy items. So we highly recommend doing a cash flow analysis to prove out that alternative energy item is more beneficial than a conventional piece of equipment. Any other questions? Okay, so we've completed 16,000 buildings for 179D all over the country for designers and for commercial building owners. We can go to the next slide. And so here's the changes to 179D. They go in effect for 1/1/2023. So this is not for your 2022 tax year. This is only for 2023 going forward. But designers not only can get it for government now, they can get it for not-for-profits, they can get it for instrumentalities, they can get it for tribal governments. So the designer is the only party that can get the tax deduction for not-for-profits, government, instrumentalities, and tribal governments. Tremendous opportunity for designers of these type of buildings. The deduction level changes, so very similar to the tax credits, the deduction actually drops. So it used to be $1.88, now it's 50 cents to $1. So the deduction has dropped to 50 cents to $1, but if you meet prevailing wage and apprenticeship, you get the 5-time bonus and it goes up to $2.50 to $5. So how do you qualify? You have to show that your building is 25 to 50% more energy efficient than a reference building. So 25% gets you the low end of the deduction, 50% gets the high end of the deduction, anywhere in between, you're in between. There's no more qualifying separately for lighting, separately for HVAC, separately for envelope. You have to qualify holistically. It's the entire building gets modeled. That's where you have to show the 25% to 50%. Retrofits and retrofits alone can go the modeling method, or they now have a new way to qualify called energy use intensity. You get the EUI before the project, you get the EUI after the project. If you're a 25% improvement, you get the minimum. If you're 50% improvement, you get the maximum. Anywhere in between, you're in between. So retrofits and retrofits alone can use EUI. And probably the thing that excited us the most is the reset. So you used to only be able to get a deduction once for the lifetime of the building. Now you can get a deduction every 3 years for a commercial building if you do a new project, or government and tax exempt every 4 years if you do a new project. You do need a new project in order to take a new tax deduction. But every 4 years, a designer can go back to the government and tax exempt buildings. Next slide. So the math, when you meet prevailing wage and apprenticeship, you take a 100,000 square foot building, it's a $250,000 deduction at the 25% level, it's a $500,000 deduction at the 50% level. You turn that into a middle school, for example, a 100,000 square foot middle school, that benefit goes to the designer. $500,000 deduction goes to the designer. How much did that designer spend on the building? They didn't spend anything. They got paid, yet they still get to take that $500,000 deduction. We have some designers that all they do is K through 12 public schools, and all they do is ground source. They have not paid income taxes since 2006. They've wiped out their income taxes all the way since 2006. So it's a tremendous benefit for the designers of buildings, and we'll show you all the building classes that the designer gets the benefit on the next slide. Okay, so what building classes qualify? On the government side, federal, state, county, we've done military bases, we've done state universities, but by far the most we do is K through 12 public schools, and the designer gets the benefit. But now, because of the IRA changes, half of all hospitals in the country are not-for-profit. All the religious institutions, all those private schools and private universities, the designer now gets the benefit for those projects. Tribal projects as well. The designer is the only party that can get those benefits. So very beneficial. The IRA changes are very beneficial to the design community in getting these projects off the ground. Next slide. Back to the commercial side, the deduction is in lieu of depreciation. So normally you would depreciate the asset over 39 years. Now you get to expense it in year 1. Now, for residential projects greater than 3 stories, it doesn't matter if it's new construction or retrofit. 179D is beneficial no matter what. But for commercial non-residential building retrofits, the Tax Cut and Job Act in 2017 gave a different way to write off those projects. You know, there's a little bit of QIP, bonus depreciation, repair reg, section 179. You can use those techniques for accelerating your depreciation. There's no reason to pay me to do 179D. So retrofits on non-residential building, commercial non-residential, there's no reason to use 179D. But for new construction, non-residential, 179D is the only way to go. And so on the commercial side, new construction is very good. Next slide. So what do we need? You need a project. You need lighting, HVAC envelope type project. You need to be the standard. The standard is ASHRAE 2007, all the way out to 2026. So ASHRAE 2007 is 16 years ago. 16 years ago, the technologies, you know, just by meeting building code in many states in this country, you will beat ASHRAE 2007 by at least the 25% level. So almost every project you do for the next 3 years should be qualifying for some level of 179D. Unfortunately, in 2027, it switches to ASHRAE 2019. We modeled 100 buildings that qualified for 2007. Only 10 of them qualified for 2019. So it's going to get a lot harder to qualify against 2019. So what this means is you're going to want to finish your projects by 2026. If you finish your projects by 2026, a lion's share of them will qualify against for 179D tax deductions. And then obviously there's a way for retrofits to qualify. Here's the technologies that tend to qualify. What I'll tell you is ground source is one technology that will have no problem qualifying against 2019 as well. But mainly a lot of these are doing something different than the reference building. If the reference building says our reference equipment is this, if you do something different, oftentimes that qualifies. So for example, a hotel, usually the reference has P-tax underneath the window. If you use a central HVAC system, oftentimes that central system will be much more energy efficient than the P-tax units, and therefore you'll end up qualifying. So sometimes it's just using technologies different. Notice the bold again, ground source, thermal storage, combined heat and power. Those projects can qualify you for the tax credit, and they can qualify you for this 179D tax deduction. Next slide. We need data to model these buildings. So that's architectural, mechanical, electrical, plumbing drawing sets. We need spec sheets on the mechanical and the lighting system. You need data to run an energy simulation model. On retrofits, we're looking for 24 months pre-project utility bills and 12 months post-project utility bills, as well as any bills during the construction process. So we're going to need that information in order to see if you qualify on a retrofit project. Next slide. As I mentioned before, government and tax exempt buildings, the designer gets the benefit. It doesn't matter if it's new construction or retrofit, both help qualify. Residential greater than 3 stories, doesn't matter, new construction, retrofit, both qualify. On commercial, it's pretty much limited to new construction only. Retrofits, typically they have other ways to qualify. So next slide. Okay, so prevailing wage and apprenticeship. This is the same rules for the tax credit 5-time bonus and the 179D 5-time bonus. Either one has to meet prevailing wage and apprenticeship. So to find out what the prevailing wage is, you go to www.sam.gov, you go to that website, you type in some information about your project and the location, and it will tell you what each trade's prevailing wage and fringe benefits are that have to be met or exceeded. You'll have to meet them or exceed. Now, in some jurisdictions in the country, there is not a labor class, for example. You then will need to get a wage determination from IRS. You send them this email, IRA prevailing wage at departmentoflabor.gov. You send it with that information, and you'll be able to get a wage determination, and then you have to pay that labor class, that amount or more, in order to qualify. You're going to want to keep records. So the records you keep is going to be certified payroll. You're going to want to keep certified payroll. That's going to help prove that you met these prevailing wage and these prevailing wage requirements. But separately, there's an apprenticeship requirement, and the next slide has the apprenticeship requirement. So if you started your project in 2023 after 129, 12.5% of total labor has to be apprentices. If you start it next year, 15% of total labor hours have to be apprentices. This is your floor. There's also a ceiling. Your apprentice to journey worker ratio must be met on a daily basis. They don't want a bunch of apprentices running around. They want enough supervision from journey workers. So the registered apprenticeship program, where you get your apprentices from, will define for you what the ratio is, and you have to meet that on a daily basis, and you have to have records that show that you meet it on a daily basis. One key note is the apprentices have to come from a registered apprenticeship program. They come from another program that's not registered, they don't qualify. So you have to find out where your apprentices are coming from, and we have to confirm that it's a registered apprenticeship program. So you need to know what program that is. There is a good faith effort exception. If you ask for apprentices and they're unable to give them to you, then every 120 days you have to ask again for the apprentices, and then you'll have met the good faith effort. But you have to meet both the prevailing wage and the apprenticeship requirement. You have to meet both of them in order to get that 5-time bonus. On the credit side, it's if you're bigger than a megawatt, but on the 179D side, there is no exception except the January 29th started the project before January 29th. That's an exception for both credit and deduction. Next slide.
We've got a question from AW. So if you applied for a lighting only 179D deduction 2 years ago, again, lighting only, can you file a new 179D deduction for a new project for HVAC upgrades under the updated rules?
You can, but because it's within the 3 years, if it's commercial, or 4 years, because it's not for profit or state and local government, because it's in that category, then what you have to do is, let's say you qualify for $4.50, you'd have to subtract the 61 cents that you might have qualified for the lighting. Or whatever you qualified for, you'd have to subtract that from whatever you qualify in the new regime. If you don't meet prevailing wage and apprenticeship, or you didn't start it before the 29th of January, then you might be in the 50 cents level. If you take 50 cents and subtract 61 cents, you're in negative numbers, so you wouldn't qualify until you reach that 4-year re-up or the 3-year re-up. So it's whatever you qualify for in the new regime minus anything in the last 4 years or the last 3 years in the old regime. You have to subtract that out. Okay. So if you just go one more slide, so this is your second chance to, the QR code on the right-hand side will auto-generate an email. If you hit send on that email, it'll auto-generate a reply that will include this slide deck for your review. If you'd like an equivalent to this recorded presentation, you can go to the QR code on the left. If you want to share it with other people that might be interested, don't hesitate to share it. If you have any questions, I'm here for the next 8 minutes or so. So I'd be glad to answer any questions people have.
We did have another question come through. How does 179D benefit nonprofit building owners? Do the designer/ESCOs offset their fees charged to the building owner with the 179D deduction?
Yeah, so we had this question a lot on the government side, and clearly there are some parties that think it might be illegal for a payment to occur from a vendor to the government. That doesn't exist on the not-for-profit side. What I would tell you is this incentive was not designed for that, but we do know people are doing some discounting, some splitting. What I would warn the designers is that the value of a deduction is not as straightforward as you might think. It is not simply deduction times your tax rate, because if you take too many of these deductions, any money you take out of your business then gets taxed at a capital gains rate, which means that the value of this deduction is really the difference between your highest marginal tax rate and the capital gains rate. So we've seen people give away too much of their deduction. So we hope designers understand that their real value in this incentive is the difference between their highest marginal tax rate and their capital gains rate. And that difference defines the true value of the deduction. And then if they want to share some of that, we highly recommend it be somehow shared in lowering fees as opposed to a check being mailed, especially for government projects. We highly frown upon checks being mailed to the government. There's a little bit of potential that it could be an illegal transaction. No case, we have not heard of any cases as of yet, but we do give you a warning that when a vendor sends a check to the government, oftentimes that's ripe with issues, but that's not the case for not-for-profits for sure.
How long does it take to receive a credit?
Yeah, so that's a great question. We don't actually know the answer. We're hopeful that it's somewhat like when you file your tax return and you wait for your refund. It's somewhere between 4 and 8 weeks after you file your taxes. So we're hopeful that it's going to be the same time frame, but it is quite possible that for commercial entities, it's probably going to be the 4 to 8 weeks. For not-for-profits and state and local, they're going to be filing something that's brand new. And so it is quite possible IRS might slow their processing down. I hope they don't do that, but nobody has gotten this, direct pay or elective pay yet. They're not going to get it until probably April or May. And so once we get that information, we'll disseminate it by our presentations, how long our clients are having to wait for that check. But we're hopeful that it's going to be in the 4 to 8 week range.
And for the ITC, is the pre-registration portal open for that yet?
It is not opened as of yet. The only platform that has opened is the low income bonus platform. And as I mentioned before, we only got till Friday. Friday is when we have until.
If you have any additional questions for us, there's our webinar email, webinars@abraxasenergy.com. And Jacob, thank you for joining us. I appreciate it. Thank you for everybody sticking with us, and we will see you next month.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.